Mercedes just did something in the first 2 races of 2026 that should not be possible. 2 races. 2 1-2 finishes. 0 engine failures. Perfect energy deployment every single lap. That alone is suspicious. But here's where it gets serious. Their customer teams, using the exact same engine, are struggling. Retirements. Electrical issues. No consistency. So how is one team dominating, while the others can't even finish? Teams started asking that exact question after China. And what they're discovering right now is deeply uncomfortable. Because this doesn't look like a normal advantage. It looks like something Formula One banned years ago. But redesigned. Hidden. Integrated. A new kind of party mode. That doesn't switch on. Because it never switches off. Subscribe now, because if this is real, Mercedes hasn't just started strong. They may have already decided the entire season. Right after the lights went out in Australia, something didn't feel normal. Not dramatic. Not obvious. But different. Mercedes didn't just take control of the race. They managed it, like they already knew the outcome. No sudden drop in speed. No visible energy saving. No moment where the driver had to back off and protect the system. Just smooth, continuous performance. Lap after lap. And at first, people ignored it. Because one race can lie. But then China happened. And suddenly, it wasn't a coincidence anymore. Same dominance. Same control. Same feeling that the car was operating without limits. Antonelli wins. Russell right behind. Sprint race under control. Different scenario, identical execution. And that's when engineers across the paddock started to pay attention. Because in Formula One, repeating perfection is never accidental. It always comes from something deeper. Something built into the car. Something designed to behave exactly like that. But here's where things start to get uncomfortable. When you break down the data, sector by sector, one detail stands out immediately. Mercedes doesn't just accelerate better. They keep accelerating longer than anyone else. And that sounds small. Almost irrelevant. Until you understand what it really means. Under the new regulations, energy deployment is limited. You can't hold maximum output for the entire straight. At some point, every car fades. The electrical energy runs out. The speed levels off. That's normal. That's expected. Mercedes doesn't fade. They keep gaining speed even at the end of the straight. Meter after meter. As if the energy never drops. And that's the moment when engineers stop thinking about performance. And start thinking about cause. Because that behavior shouldn't exist. Not under these rules. Not with these limitations. But this is where the story takes a turn most people didn't expect. Because the real clue didn't come from Mercedes. It came from what was happening behind them. Or more precisely, what was going wrong. McLaren, one of the strongest teams on paper, didn't even start the race in China. Both cars out. Before the formation lap. Electrical failures. Both connected to the power unit systems. And suddenly, the situation becomes impossible to ignore. Because now you have 2 completely opposite realities. One team, flawless. The others, struggling to even finish. Same engine. Same regulations. Completely different outcomes. And that contradiction is where everything begins. Because in Formula One, when identical hardware produces different results, the difference is never the machine. It's the understanding. And that's the part nobody outside the paddock sees. Because what Mercedes has right now isn't just a fast engine. It's a way of using it that nobody else has fully figured out yet. And that realization is exactly what triggered the next question. A much bigger one. Because if the performance isn't coming from a visible upgrade, then where is it really coming from? And that question is exactly what led teams to something much deeper. Because when you can't explain performance from the outside, you start looking inside. Not at the obvious parts. Not the visible ones. But the areas nobody talks about. The areas that don't show up on TV graphics. Engine mapping. Energy flow. Thermal behavior. The invisible side of performance. And this is where things start to get very interesting. Because when engineers compared data from Australia and China, they noticed something that didn't match any normal pattern. Mercedes isn't just deploying energy better. They're recovering it faster. Much faster. And that changes everything. Because in this new era, you don't just win by deploying power. You win by how quickly you can get it back. Every braking zone. Every lift. Every micro moment of recovery matters. Most teams harvest energy, then wait. There's a delay. A gap. A compromise. Mercedes doesn't seem to have that gap. They harvest, and almost immediately redeploy. Again. And again. And again. And this creates something that looks very familiar. Not identical, but close enough to raise concern. Continuous peak performance. Not a spike. Not a boost. A sustained push. And that's where the comparison becomes unavoidable. Because years ago, that's exactly what made party mode so powerful. Short bursts. Maximum output. Unmatched pace. But limited. Restricted. Banned. What Mercedes appears to have now is something far more advanced. Because there's no clear activation. No visible trigger. No moment where the system suddenly changes. It just stays there, operating at a level others can't reach. And that's what makes it so difficult to challenge. Because if there's no switch, there's nothing to ban. If there's no spike, there's nothing obvious to measure. It's just performance. Consistent. Repeatable. Relentless. And now teams are starting to connect this with something even more technical. Something deeper inside the engine. Combustion efficiency. Because if your combustion process is cleaner, more stable, you generate less heat, you lose less energy, you gain more control over the entire system. And suddenly, your electrical deployment becomes easier to manage, more predictable, more sustainable. And that's exactly what Mercedes is showing right now. No overheating, no sudden drops, no instability. While others are constantly balancing on the edge, Mercedes is operating comfortably within it. And that's not supposed to happen. Not this early, not under brand new regulations. Which brings us back to something the paddock is now openly discussing. The possibility that Mercedes found a way to make the engine behave differently under real conditions. Not in inspection, not in theory, but on track. At full temperature, at full load. Because if that's true, then everything we're seeing starts to make sense. The consistency, the control, the ability to sustain performance when others can't. It's not magic. It's not luck. It's understanding. A level of understanding that turns a legal engine into something no one else can match. And that's why this situation is becoming so tense. Because if this really is the case, then Formula One isn't just dealing with a fast team. It's dealing with a team that has already unlocked the key to this entire regulation era. And if that's true, then catching them won't just take upgrades. It will take time. A lot of time. Time that, right now, no one can afford to lose. And this is where the entire situation starts to shift from performance to politics. Because once teams suspect something like this, they don't just sit back and accept it. They start pushing. Quietly at first. Engineers talking to engineers. Data being compared behind closed doors. Questions being asked without being asked publicly. And all of those questions are pointing in the same direction. Not at what Mercedes is doing, but at how it's being measured. Because right now, the FIA checks engines under controlled conditions. Stable temperatures, predictable environments, everything designed to ensure fairness. But races aren't like that. They're chaotic, hot, unstable. And if an engine behaves differently under those real conditions, then the current checks might not be telling the full story. That's the concern. That's where the pressure is building. Ferrari is looking at it. Honda is looking at it. Audi is looking at it. And they're all starting to ask for the same thing. Not accusations. Not protests. Clarity. They want the FIA to measure engines differently, to test them under real operating temperatures, to see how they behave when everything is pushed to the limit. Because if there's even a small difference, that could explain everything. And this is where the tension becomes impossible to hide. Because if the FIA agrees to change the way engines are monitored, Mercedes could lose their advantage instantly. Overnight. No upgrade. No development. Just a rule clarification. And suddenly, the entire balance of the grid could shift. But if the FIA decides not to act, then the opposite happens. Mercedes keeps that advantage. Race after race. Weekend after weekend. And the gap doesn't just stay. It grows. Because while other teams are still trying to understand the problem, Mercedes is already refining the solution. And that's the part that worries everyone the most. This might not be their final form. This might just be the beginning. Because when a team understands something at this level, development becomes easier, more precise, more targeted. While others are still guessing, they're optimizing. And that creates a gap that's almost impossible to close mid-season. We've seen this before. Entire eras defined by one early breakthrough. One interpretation of the rules that nobody else saw in time. And by the moment they did, it was already too late. That's the fear now. Not just losing races, but losing an entire generation of competition. Because if Mercedes really has built a system that behaves like a permanent party mode, then every lap they complete is a reminder that the others are chasing something they don't fully understand yet. And in Formula One, chasing without understanding, is the most dangerous position you can be in. Because you can copy what you see, but you can't copy what you don't yet understand. And right now, that invisible layer, that hidden behavior, that perfect balance between power, energy, and control, still belongs to Mercedes. But there's one final piece to this. One that goes beyond engineering, beyond performance, beyond even the rules themselves. Because in the end, this isn't just about what Mercedes discovered. It's about how long the rest of Formula One will allow it to exist. And that answer is getting closer with every race. And this is where everything finally comes together. Because after Australia, after China, after all the data, the comparisons, the quiet conversations, teams are no longer asking if Mercedes is fast. They're asking something much more uncomfortable. Have they already solved the entire 2026 regulation era? Because if you step back and look at the full picture, it's not just one advantage. It's too many things working perfectly at the same time. Power without visible limits. Energy deployment without drop-off. Recovery without delay. Reliability without failure. And when all of that exists together, it stops looking like a strong package. It starts looking like a complete solution. And that's the real fear inside the paddock. Because solving one part of these regulations is difficult. Solving all of them, this early, that's something else entirely. That's what creates dominance. But here's the part that changes everything. Because if Mercedes really has built this system, then what we've seen so far is not even the full extent of it. Because development in Formula One is not linear. When you understand the concept, every upgrade becomes more effective, more precise, more dangerous. And that means while other teams are still trying to reach Mercedes, Mercedes is already moving forward, extending the gap, refining something that already works. And that's how eras begin. Quietly, without a single dramatic moment. Just consistent results that slowly become impossible to challenge. And by the time everyone realizes what's happening, it's already established. That's exactly what this feels like. Not a surprise, not a shock, but the early stage of something much bigger. Because think about it. If customer teams are still struggling to even operate the engine properly, if rivals are still questioning how the performance is being generated, if the FIA hasn't yet changed how it evaluates these systems, then nothing is slowing Mercedes down. Nothing is forcing them to change. Nothing is closing the gap. And in Formula One, that combination is rare. And when it happens, it defines championships. Sometimes, entire eras. So now we arrive at the final realization. Not a theory. Not a rumor. A pattern. Mercedes didn't bring back party mode as we knew it. They evolved it. Transformed it into something constant. Something integrated. Something that doesn't activate, because it never turns off. And that's why it's so difficult to fight. Because you can't point at it.